Hi everyone and welcome to the Unit 4 U.S. History test. This is the modified version of the test. I'll be doing a recording of reading the questions and the answer options for you. The Unit 4 test has 39 multiple choice questions to it that you'll be highlighting the answers to. Use your highlighting tool in Microsoft Word or OpenOffice if you're using OpenOffice. You can make sure that you take particular attention, close attention to question number 40. It is an essay question worth 20 points. Don't skip this question. I always go over this in a unit test review ahead of time, so you should have your question written out and ready ahead of time before you go into your test. Submitting your test, you want to submit this test to me through Kmail. The test is scheduled for Thursday, January 10th, and it needs to be submitted by Monday, January 14th, or before the 14th, so that a 0 will not be placed in your gradebook for this test. Let's get started. Number 1, which was an early event in the Cold War? The United States refused to include Russia in the Marshall Plan, East Germany formed an alliance with the Soviet Union, or Stalin kept troops in Eastern Europe instead of holding promised elections. Number 2, what was the Iron Curtain? The imaginary wall separating communist countries from democracies, a powerful agreement forged at Yalta at the end of World War II, or the security arrangement that Stalin made to protect himself? Number 3, American diplomat George F. Kennan urged the U.S. government to adopt a policy firmly opposing Soviet expansion and keeping communism in check. What was this policy called? Confinement, containment, or closure? Number 4, what name was given to the U.S. policy of giving economic and military aid to countries to restrict the spread of communism? Was that the Marshall Plan, the Yalta Agreement, or the Truman Doctrine? Number 5, what was the Berlin Airlift, the American and British response to the Soviet blockade of Berlin, the final attempt by Germans to force the Soviets out of East Germany, or the American and British attempt to evacuate Germans wanting to leave Berlin? Number 6, what military alliance did the Western Bloc of nations form to defend against Soviet aggression? The Organization of American States, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or the United Nations? Number 7, why did the United States implement a policy to help Japan recover and rebuild after World War II? To reduce guilt over dropping atomic bombs, to develop an Asian ally against communism, or to provide European nations with an example? Number 8, what act signaled the beginning of the Korean War? North and South Korea joined forces to invade Japan, China invaded North Korea, or North Korea invaded South Korea? Number 9, which U.S. general was fired by President Truman near the end of the Korean War and why? Patton for lack of leadership, MacArthur for insubordination, Eisenhower because he was a rival. Number 10, what was the outcome of the Korean War? The two Koreas united and became a democracy. North and South Korea remained separate with a demilitarized zone along the 38th parallel, or China took over North Korea and the UN took over South Korea. Number 11, who was not subject of Red Scare investigations? Alger Hiss, Ethel Rosenberg, or Alvin Barkley? Number 12, what was Mccarthyism? A policy of providing economic relief to South Korea and other war-torn nations, a tactic of spreading fear with often baseless accusations of communist activities in the United States, or the belief that the United States must save European economies following World War II. Number 13, President Eisenhower's foreign policy stressed peace, threatened massive retaliation for attacks, and increased the size of the military, expected other nations to do their part, or built up the nuclear arsenal. Number 14, in his farewell address, what did President Eisenhower caution the nation against? The power of military-industrial complex, delaying full buildup of the military, the increased power of the United Nations. Number 15, why did the CIA support covert activity to restore the Shah to power in Iran? To encourage democracy and support freedom, to protect oil interests and prevent the spread of communism, or to prevent the spread of biological weapons? Number 16, why did the United States support the overthrow of an elected Guatemalan president? To prevent the spread of communism and protect U.S. business interests, to continue to uphold the foundations of the Monroe Doctrine, to generate interest in Guatemalan politics and spread the interest of democracy. Number 17, what was one result of U.S. covert actions in Latin America and the Middle East? More nations were grateful for U.S. support and involvement, anti-American sentiment in those regions increased, or, since the actions were covert, few knew of their existence, so there was little impact. Number 18, what was the Eisenhower Doctrine? The attempt to enhance United Nations efforts to provide relief for famine in Africa, the policy that committed American aid and troops to protect the Middle East from communist aggression, or the effort to support communist nations with foreign aid to give them the economic basis for democracy. Number 19, which was not a reason for post-World War II economic growth in the United States. Consumers were eager to buy after wartime rationing restrictions. Prices dropped dramatically after military demand for goods dropped. Government funding continued supporting research and manufacturing. Number 20, what happened when developers built affordable, mass-produced houses in places such as Levittown? Schools hired teachers whose salaries were paid by the developers. The federal government offered tax incentives to anyone who moved to the suburbs. The suburbs grew. 21, what was the baby boom? A new growth in intelligence experienced by babies with improved nutrition, the increased early childhood education that began in the late 60s, or the tremendous increase in population following World War II. Number 22, what helped fuel post-war consumer spending? The ease of obtaining credit, a significant increase in the interest rates, or an end of war bonuses for soldiers. Number 23, what was one result of the car culture that developed in the post-war era? Families found it difficult to purchase cars because production could not meet demands. High-speed limits went into effect, causing concerns about fuel consumption, or Congress passed legislation to construct the interstate highway system. Number 24, which is true of the early development of computers in the 1950s. They provided improved accuracy in consumer billing and payments. They were mainly used by the government and the military. They increased speed of personal communication as the telegraph did in the 19th century. Number 25, how did television affect society in the 1950s? It increased newspaper circulation by highlighting events and generating interest in getting additional details. It encouraged people to participate in their democracy and raised the percentage of people voting in elections. Or it promoted the development of a common culture and communicated the idea that affluence was the norm. 26, which was not a sign of religious resurgence in the 1950s, posting the Ten Commandments in federal buildings, adopting "In God We Trust" as the national motto, or using the media to deliver religious messages from evangelists. Number 27, what was one effect of McCarthyism in the 1950s? People supported candidates who opposed McCarthy, people felt a pressure to conform to avoid suspicion, or people formed resistance groups to question it. What was the premise of the organization Man? The most successful business will conform to organizational standards that they help develop. Conformity to bureaucratic norms could make workers incapable of independent thought, or all organizations should clearly state the expectations they have for employees. Number 29, what contributed to John F. Kennedy's election to the presidency? The televised debates, religious intervention, or a weak opponent? Number 30, which quote expresses JFK's inspirational inaugural message to young voters? Change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past or present are certain to miss the future. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Or, conformity is the jailer of freedom and the enemy of growth. Number 31, what caused blacks to pursue civil rights more vigorously after World War II? With the population explosion, there were more blacks to advocate for civil rights. They resented not being eligible for the educational benefits of the GI Bill, or despite service in the military, blacks returned to find that Jim Crow laws were still in place. Number 32, which played an important part in the civil rights movement, riots in Watts, Detroit, and Newark, freedom rides to Washington, D.C., or a march from Little Rock to Montgomery. Number 33, which civil rights advocate became a Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas, Medgar Evers, or Thurgood Marshall? Number 34, what was the title of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous document explaining his philosophy? The Table of Brotherhood, Letter from Birmingham Jail, or Selma Voting Rights Address? Number 35, who was not a part of the movement to see major civil rights legislation passed? Malcolm X, Homer Plessy, or Stokely Carmichael? Number 36, what was the key provision of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, requiring colleges to apply rules of affirmative action to their admissions programs, providing fair housing and eliminating segregation in public places, eliminating segregation in public accommodations? Number 37, what was the unanimous ruling in Brown versus Board of Education? The principle of separate but equal schools is acceptable, public school choice is legal, or separate but equal schools are fundamentally unequal and unconstitutional. Number 38, what was one of the most important educational initiatives in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society? Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Head Start program, or Pell Grants? 39. What did Lyndon Johnson support to provide for the needs of the poor and elderly? A new federal welfare initiative, remedial education programs, or Medicare and Medicaid? For number 40, this is a 20-point essay question. You're going to choose one of the options below, option 1 or option 2, listed down here. Each gives background information first. For option 1, an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law. Those were the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Capture his philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience. He believed this was the only way to achieve the goals of the civil rights movement. Choose at least 2 events or incidences between the end of World War II and the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Explain how each example of Dr. King's message, explain how each exemplifies or is an example of Dr. King's message. Each example is worth 10 points. In option 2, television changed culture in the United States and later the world. Americans began buying televisions in the 1950s, and by the end of the decade, 90% of families owned one. In the early 1960s, Newton Minow served as chairman of the Federal Communications Commission and said that it was a vast wasteland. When television is good, nothing is better. When it's bad, nothing is worse. Reflect on this idea as you describe how TV influenced society during the 1950s and how TV would impact later generations of Americans. Each portion of this essay is worth 10 points. Make sure that you spend as much time talking about television in the 1950s as television in the generations past the 1950s. Don't just talk about how TV has impacted your life. That's not what the question is asking, although you can certainly include the impact on your generation as well. The essay itself, once you chose one of the 2 options, will be worth a total of 20 points. Good luck on your test.